Good evening and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool. South Africa is known as the rape capital of the world. And this is not just because of sensationalist headlines about gruesome sexual assaults that we see littered across newsstands every year. This is because we have the highest rate of reported rapes in the whole world. Tonight we are speaking about Sexual Offences Courts, what they are, and the advocacy by Rape Crisis and other organizations to implement more sexual offences courts to reduce secondary victimization to survivors who are navigating the justice system. After the break, we will be speaking to a representative from Rape Crisis, but before that, we spoke to a survivor to find out what her journey was like after she reported and navigated the justice system. Let's hear what she had to say. With us tonight to give us some insight on what the post-reporting process is for a rape survivor and what it's really like to navigate the justice system is Chipo, who is a rape survivor and has joined us to share some of her journey that she experienced in 2013 and 2014. Chipo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first I want to applaud you and to say thank you so much for being brave enough to come and speak. We know that South Africa has the highest rate of reported rapes in the world, that the chances are, I often say there's so few of us speaking out, but still, as we speak out, we speak for hundreds and thousands of women. And so I really wanted to say thank you for that. And then I wanted to sort of ask, what was, and it's really an open question, in terms of what the process was for you having to navigate the court system after you reported your sexual offense?
To be honest, it was, looking back now, at that time, I was quite numb to the whole thing, to the whole process. I did not understand what was going on. I didn't know what was going on. I was simply going through the motions, getting a subpoena, being told you have to be in court on this day. And basically that was it. So now when I reflect back on what happened, that's when I asked myself, or I questioned the process to say, wait, this was not right. I don't think this is how things were supposed to happen. There was no one to walk me through or walk us through the whole process. The first time I got to court, we were just told we need to be at court, and I was with my parents. And we were just told to see the court clerk, and then that was it. And we left, and then we were told, okay, you will receive another subpoena to tell you when the actual court date is. And when the actual court date came, I think it was almost a year later, after the incident, not really a year, a couple of months later, it was the next year in 2014, on the 21st of January. And then I went to court, and it was just the weirdest experience I've ever had. And that was it, to be honest. So it was not a very straightforward process. And to say I understand it even up until now, I do not.
I often say, and I was saying to someone earlier, that one of the problems is, no one teaches you about court. There's sort of no context for this process until something happens and you enter it. And I think of like a deer caught in the headlights when you enter the court system, because you know nothing.
Exactly.
Yes, and often survivors report saying, as you said now, there's a sort of I don't know what it is, a hunch or an intuition that this is not the way it should be. This is not sort of dignified. Do you think it would have helped if you had someone walking you through the process, explaining why you needed to be at court on certain days for what, or at least helping you to know what to expect?
Definitely, it really would have helped. At least maybe now I would have closure as well regarding the case, because it's just recently, when I think last year or the year before last, that I actually went into deep thought about it, about the whole process, to say, wait a minute, something here does not seem right. What exactly happened that year? So if there had been someone to walk me through that whole process, because to be honest, for me now, when I look back at it, it's almost like uh, I can say I feel like it was just dismissed as nothing.
People, as a survivor, as someone who's gone through that system and that process, um, and you know, with the rape crisis, the rape survivor justice campaign, you know, as a survivor, if you could speak to government, I mean, we want to tell everybody, but if we could speak to them and we could say, this is what is necessary, what are some of the things that you would suggest or recommend be implemented to help survivors navigate the system better?
To be honest, if there can be proper support for survivors from the moment you go and report to the police, someone to at least explain to you how it's going to work. And if you can meet even the prosecutors before, I never got to meet the prosecutors before the case. I saw them on the day that I went to court, and they called me outside the door. I spoke to them while standing by the door. So having someone say, okay, we are going to meet the prosecutors, these are the prosecutors, this is the process that you're going to follow. And if you're not comfortable with it, there's an alternative that you can have. But just to have a clear view of what's actually going on in your life, because it is a very traumatic time. So in those moments, you don't really have time to sit down and question how things are going on or how things are happening. It's only later that you can then think about it and realize that, wait a minute, there is another trauma that I now went through that I now have to deal with, because things were not explained to me carefully, and I was not walked through this process in a way I felt comfortable, and I got closure when it came to my case.
Wow, I think I can't even wrap my head around the fact that you only met the prosecutor on the day that you went to court. It is just how in any way could you feel comfortable walking into that courtroom and or into that process, not even knowing the person that is prosecuting the case? Chipo, I want to say thank you so much, but I also want to ask, and so your, and I don't want to say advice, I just want to, I guess, any words for survivors. And I ask this because as we've seen, as we've tracked sexual offences in 2017, you know, there was a report by the Medical Research Council that showed less than 10% of cases end in conviction in South Africa in terms of sexual offences. There are lots of survivors who are going through the system who probably won't find justice, but are taking the brave steps to report it anyway, to move through that system anyway. And as someone who's been through that system, do you have any words for them?
To be honest, one would want to say, keep holding on and persevere, but it's not the easiest of things to do when you are in that situation. But if you have started the process, see it through to the end. Speak to people, look for people that can give you the correct advice. Even go to court, demand justice, demand answers for what's going on with your case, because at the end of the day, it's your life, and you have to deal with the secondary trauma that comes with going through this process. It's taking so long, taking years and years, and then you still have to start healing. So demand the answers from the people around you, from the people that are helping you, from the police, from the investigating officers, from, you know, everybody that's around you that's saying they're helping with the case. Demand those answers, demand to know what is going on with your case, and also just ask for help, for someone to walk you through the whole process so you completely understand it. And when you've told yourself that you want justice, sometimes the road that leads to justice is not clear cut and smooth sailing. You need to go through some rough edges, some rough patches. But eventually, if you really do fight for what you believe in, I believe at the end of the day, you probably will get it. It's not the easiest of things to do, the easiest of journey to go on. Um, but maybe for your healing, you do what's best for your healing. If it's still going through the process, or if it's stopping the whole process, take care of your mental health, your emotional health, your physical health, put yourself first and what would be best for you as an individual.
Thank you so much, Chipo. That is very wonderful advice, actually, and wonderful words for people who are dealing with this, and even for those who have dealt with it before that might have finished their journey through the system. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was an honor to be here.
We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching the Womxn Show, and tonight we are speaking about Sexual Offences Courts and the long journey to have those implemented and what's been happening since the first Sexual Offences Court at Wynberg was created. And joining me now is Jeanne Bodenstein from Rape Crisis. She is the Advocacy Specialist. Jeanne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jeanne, before the break, we heard from some survivors who have sort of been through the system and how traumatic that experience was for them, sort of generally. It is a traumatic process in itself, but there are many aspects of the Sexual Offences Court that makes it even more traumatic for survivors. So some of those things, as we heard, is sort of being in the same waiting room as your perpetrator. The way they are treated also, we hear a lot about services and stakeholders in the system not being trauma informed. So it's really being treated like a case number as opposed to something terrible that happened to someone. So I wanted to start by asking, how has Sexual Offences Courts changed the way that sexual offences have been dealt with, and what are some of the things that should be implemented, or we hope will be implemented in Sexual Offences Courts to make this process better for survivors?
The whole aim of Sexual Offences Courts is obviously to reduce the secondary trauma suffered by survivors. And the way that sexual courts aim to do this is by having specially trained personnel, special services, special infrastructure, and that includes a specially trained prosecutor who's aware of kind of sensitive to trauma, a specially trained magistrate who has special knowledge of the Sexual Offences Act, but also really practical things like making sure that the infrastructure limits secondary trauma, so that there is a safe waiting room where survivors can wait, that there's a safe bathroom for them to use. They could even testify in a separate room, not in the courtroom where the accused person is also present. So Sexual Offences Courts really aim to do this. And a big win in the past kind of year and a half is that these courts are now mandated in terms of legislation. So the Minister of Justice could designate Sexual Offences Courts, and then there's a set of regulations that the courts have to comply with. And the reason why this is great is it gives communities an opportunity to really hold government accountable for these courts. But still that's great if your case goes to trial. But what we see is that a lot of people don't actually report because the criminal justice system is just too intimidating, or the police, they don't trust the police. But also that if people do report, the correct evidence isn't collected, or they just don't want to be involved in the case anymore, and they withdraw their testimony, and then the case perhaps doesn't go to trial. So we really have to also ensure that people have safe access to the criminal justice system by providing immediate, comprehensive post-rape care that people can access after the rape.
I didn't know that it was mandated, because I was actually going to ask, previously it hasn't been mandated. And as I was looking up sort of the history, and Rape Crisis did a wonderful 4-part series on the history of Sexual Offences Courts, I had seen that it wasn't mandated at that point, but that there is, or, you know, there sort of was, I guess, something, you know, get 106, I think it was, or 116 sexual offences courts by 2023. And so I wanted to ask you about that process. You know, this long process of trying to implement sexual offences courts, us sort of trying to get to 106 by 2023. You know, where are we now?
Part of the Rape Survivors Justice campaign, and I would say a big part of the Rape Survivors Justice campaign, was really to make sure that these courts are included in legislation. Because the way that the Department of Justice rolled them out, when they kind of reignited the Sexual Offences Court project in 2013, was looking at the blueprint that was released in a report in 2013 with a lot of requirements, and kind of seeing what can, which of those requirements could they possibly meet, and then setting up a sexual offences court. But there was no real way for communities to measure whether that sexual offences court actually complied with a set of regulations or minimum standards. Also, there was no definition of a sexual offences court. So what was called a sexual offences court on the Department of Justice's website might not actually be a sexual offences court. And there could be other courts in the country that comply with the minimum requirements, but that aren't called sexual offences courts. So we realized that without, regulatory framework, which includes minimum standards and who is responsible for what, we can't really measure how is government doing on the rollout of sexual offences courts, and communities can't hold Department of Justice accountable for that. So early last year, Section 55A of the Sexual Offences Act came into operation, which it gives the power to the Minister of Justice to designate sexual offences courts in terms of regulations. And the regulations then provide a set of minimum standards that sexual offences courts have to comply with, and the regulations came into operation also early last year. So I think a lot of strides have been made in the past 4 years to make sure that that these courts are designated in terms of legislation and that there's a set of minimum standards. But the process now is that the Department of Justice obviously has to look at the courts that they established as sexual offences courts, and to try and see if those courts comply with the regulations, and then doing the official designation process. So that kind of led to a situation where for the past almost a year, no new courts have been added to the list, not because they haven't been rolled out, but because the Department of Justice is in this transition process from the sexual offences courts that were kind of established in terms of the blueprint, and making sure that those courts apply with the regulations so that they can be designated. And we'll have to wait until that process is complete to get a real picture of how many sexual offences courts are designated in the country. So how many do comply with those minimum standards. And while this is a cumbersome process, the benefit is that we know what we can expect from a sexual offences court. And you know that you can expect a prosecutor that's specially trained. You know that you can expect a safe waiting area. You know that you can expect to not run into the accused person in the hallway or in the waiting room. You know that you can expect psychosocial support. So I think that's a really big win, to know that that we can hold government accountable for minimum standards of the Sexual Offences Court.
Thanks, Jeanne. And you raise such important points. I mean, especially the one about expectation. I often say, we learn nothing about the court system, and it's like you're blindsided when you entered it. And I think the expectation, after speaking to many, many survivors, we do expect going in there to sort of feel safe. We don't expect to see the perpetrator sitting across from us. And those sort of micro experiences all build up into making it a really unsafe and uncomfortable and scary, really. A lot of them just reported feeling terrified, like that terrified experience. I wanted to ask also, so when you, like lots of survivors now, like we say, you don't interact with the system until you need to. So what does the system sort of look like now? What prompted the first Sexual Offences Court that was opened in 1993? What was that experience like for survivors?
If you don't have access to a sexual offences court, and I think obviously 30 years ago, there was a lot less sensitization. Justice officials knew a lot less about secondary trauma. But really, it was an experience that probably was very intimidating. As you said, we don't learn about courts at school. We don't have field trips to courts. So it really, the whole criminal justice process can really be very intimidating. And I think even with sexual offences courts, a lot of people still experience it because you have to access the system, right? You have to, even if you don't want to report a case, you still have to access medical care. So that's why it's really important, I think, for people to, from the get-go, from the first interaction with the criminal justice system, to make it a safe experience and an experience where the survivor can feel supported. And at the moment, we have 55 TCCs across the country, but these TCCs are not accessible to people all over. Most of these TCCs are in urban areas, so people in rural areas still don't have access to comprehensive post-rape care. So we really need comprehensive post-rape care services when people need to access the criminal justice system. So immediately after the rape or as soon as after, to access a service where you can get medical care, where you can have a forensic examination done. If you at a later stage might decide to lay a charge, where you can have psychosocial support. And very importantly, part of that is someone that explains to you how the criminal justice system works. That there will be a consultation with a prosecutor, that you will be expected possibly to testify. And it's really important then also to get a referral for long-term counseling. So those first steps into the criminal justice system is what we really need to make sure that those are safe for survivors and that survivors have access to a package of services that will look after their health, that will look after their mental health, that will collect the evidence for the prosecution, and that will also make sure that they receive referrals for long-term counseling.
And Jeanne, I mean, one of the central messages of the Rape Survivors Justice Campaign is justice, right? So we want to increase justice for survivors, and that dedicated sexual offences courts can assist with that. And that's within the context of the fact that we actually have a very low conviction rate in South Africa for sexual offences. How will having dedicated sexual offences courts improve? And you used this earlier, I think. You spoke about processes and evidence going missing possibly dockets or evidence not taken properly. I often am astounded by the fact that after you report, you will give your initial statement or write the initial affidavit, and like up to 3 years later, you're sitting in court and being able to be held accountable for the memory gap from that first report. So things like that. How will dedicated sexual offences courts help with the process of seeking justice?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think it's envisioned to assist on different levels. So, firstly, sexual offences courts are supposed to be manned by specially trained personnel. So these are prosecutors and magistrates who have special training in the Sexual Offences Act, and who, by virtue of that special training, can then prosecute and adjudicate these matters with experience and expertise. Secondly, the safer and more less traumatic sexual offences court is also aimed at keeping the survivor willing to testify for a longer period of time. You can imagine if you have to go to a court where you're constantly scared, where you're constantly re-traumatized, you don't necessarily want to stay part of that process and give your testimony. But in a lot of cases, the survivor's testimony might be the only testimony. So the longer we can make sure that the survivor feels safe and supported in the court system, the better the chance that they are willing to testify. And obviously that testimony is often the strong testimony in the prosecution's case. Thirdly, what we really want is for a sexual offences court to be linked to a comprehensive post-rape care service, so that immediately after the rape, if a survivor accesses such a service, that the forensic evidence can be collected in the correct manner, that there is a link with the prosecutor and with the police, so that the evidence can make it to the prosecution for them to use in the trial. And then I think also in the fourth place, the kind of oversight over the police. So although the prosecution isn't responsible for oversight over SAPS, the regulations of sexual offences courts make provision for prosecutor-led investigations. So that means that the prosecutor is involved in the police's investigation. This is a specially trained prosecutor who then can ask the SAPS member, please look for this piece of evidence, or I need a statement from this person. And immediately that makes the collection of evidence a more holistic approach, and also with the input from a specially trained prosecutor. So I think on those bases, the sexual offences courts really have to assist us in getting more convictions, because prosecutors can't prosecute if they don't have sufficient evidence, and we have to make sure that that there is sufficient evidence, and that happens from quite early on in the process.
Thank you, Jeanne. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about sexual offences courts. why it's necessary, where we are in terms of implementation for it, where to go from here, and how do we support advocacy towards implementing more sexual offences courts. And joining me is Jeanne Bodenstein from the Rape Crisis. She's the Advocacy Specialist. Jeanne, so before the break, you were speaking about what sexual offences courts, how it can assist us in achieving more justice, just in terms of processes that need to be followed. And I often also speak about the fact that it is such a long process with multiple stakeholders involved, from the minute, like your post-reporting process. So from the minute you give your statement to the police and whatever happens after that. And then the court case comes. And we saw that, in the report by the Medical Research Council, Rape Justice in South Africa, that was released in 2017, very many cases are dropped because the process takes so long. I mean, I was shocked, up to 3 years. Even sometimes really young kids are being put on the stand up to 3 years after the event happened. So, can I ask, why do these cases take so long? And also, how will sexual offences courts help us reduce the amount of time that a case goes through the system?
There are many reasons why cases might take long. Some have to do with kind of administrative delays, like one of the parties being ill, or one of the prosecutor being ill, or the defense attorney, or the magistrate going on leave. And then also with regards to delays for getting the DNA reports that has to be used for evidence, perhaps not being able to reach one or more of the witnesses. I also know that delay is often used by defense attorneys as a tactic, and it might be that the accused person isn't out on bail, so they wait in jail for the process to conclude, and then they have to testify, but they aren't brought to the court. So there's really a wide range of reasons for the delays. But often it is because of equipment failure, believe it or not. And that is because the CCTV equipment that links the courtroom to the testifying room is broken, and there's only a tender for one service provider to fix it, and they are in Johannesburg and the court is in Limpopo. So a lot of the delays are due to those kinds of red tape problems. And we realized this when we assisted the Department of Justice to draft the regulations for these courts. And we included provisions that makes it possible for to resolve those kinds of issues quicker. So for the sexual offences courts to get priority when equipment needs to be repaired, or service equipment needs to be serviced, or even the fact that there are 2 prosecutors per sexual offences court, so that if the one is ill or at a training, that the other prosecutor can manage the case, so that it doesn't need to be postponed. Because what we really need to do is we need to limit the amount of postponements. And the way to do that is to make sure that the equipment is in working order, that the people who needs to be present, for instance, the prosecutor or the magistrate, that they are dedicated to the sexual offences court, that they don't need to run to 50 other different places. We need to make sure that the link with SAPS is solid, so that when the DNA evidence is needed, that it's available. When a accused person needs to be collected from a holding facility, that is done. So some of those issues are addressed in the regulations for the courts, as I mentioned. But unfortunately, not all the delays can be excluded. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need psychosocial support in the court process, with a court supporter provided by an NGO, so that there is a human that stays constant and that can go with the survivor into the courtroom, that is there to meet the survivor every time that they have to come to the court, that can give them a cup of coffee. So even if there are postponements, that we try to limit the impact that it has, ensuring that survivors receive witness fees to compensate them for the transport cost coming to the court. So I think it really, Sexual Offences Courts and the regulations really attempt to address the postponements and to make the process as smooth as possible. But obviously it can't eliminate all of the postponements.
So Jeanne, thank you very much for that. And I think that you've listed like sort of a lot of things that are really important. I mean, especially even just mentioning sort of compensation for the transport for women traveling, because that is a big thing. We know that especially with all of the delays, that people have to travel up and down. So those are part of like the things that make the system and make the process so traumatic. We have a certain amount of sexual offences courts in South Africa now that are either fully or to a degree have some of these things in place that help survivors navigate the system better. If we move away from that and we look at survivors who are going through sort of normal court system where there are no sexual offences courts, I just want to clarify. So they go into sort of a normal criminal court, and their cases get tried alongside other things like murders. Like there's just nothing. It's just a process for a survivor who is going through court. Literally is sort of like a normal process. And I also wanted to ask, just in terms of that, with magistrates and prosecutors who are not trained or specialized in sexual offences, it's just sort of tried as a general crime.
It's true that the kind of the infrastructural adjustments wouldn't be there, right? So you would share a waiting room with the accused person. You would use the public bathroom. The National Prosecuting Authority does try and make sure that all the prosecutors who prosecute sexual offences have some degree of specialization in sexual offences. And rape is tried at the regional court level, and all regional magistrates in their interviews for appointment get asked questions about sexual offences. However, the fact is that a lot of survivors still have to access normal regional courts when they have to testify, when they are survivors of rape. And that can be extremely traumatic. As Rape Crisis, for instance, we have had a court supporter at the Khayelitsha Regional Court for more than a decade, although that court is not yet designated as a sexual offences court. And that is also the case in some other parts of the country. But we really, really want all survivors to have access to a sexual offences court. So that would mean that all the regional courts in the country would have to have a sexual offences court. And we're looking at just over 200 regional courts. So that's the aim of the Rape Survivors Justice Campaign, to hold government accountable for rolling out sexual offences courts and designating them at every regional court in the country, because no rape survivor should have to go through a normal court they should have access to infrastructure and people and services that reduce secondary trauma.
So in the 4-part series that Rape Crisis did, in a sort of a blog article series, one of the things that was mentioned, I think, towards the end is that implementing sexual offences courts is a very sort of expensive and time-consuming endeavour. And I think, you know, what I'm reading in terms of expenses is because there's a lot of the infrastructure, you know, for instance, separate waiting rooms and so forth. If you are speaking about already, you know, some of the issues we're experiencing are just like, you know, technical failure, devices are not working. I'm happy that it's finally been regulated and it's in the legislation, it's been mandated now, but I'm struggling to sort of feel hopeful if this is where we are and this is where we need to go. So I guess I'm just asking for comment on that.
I totally hear your concern, and in the beginning of the process, we had the exact same concern, because the blueprint for sexual offences courts that was released in 2013 and that the Department of Justice kind of used as a guide for the first round of sexual offences courts had a lot of requirements with regards to form. So it had specific requirements with regards to furniture and the placement of doors, and not only a separate waiting room for survivors, but a separate waiting room for adult survivors and a separate waiting room for child survivors. So it really had extremely high ideals. And although I think that's good, we just realized that that's not affordable. There's no way that we can roll out sexual offences courts so that every survivor have access to one if we use that as a minimum standard. And so when we worked on the regulations, we really asked ourselves, what is going to achieve the function? So what is going to achieve a reduction in secondary trauma, and what is kind of the formalistic requirements? And we tried to cut them out. So instead of including the requirement that the waiting room must be painted in certain colors and that the furniture must be sourced from a specific supplier, and that there must be 2 waiting rooms for survivors, we said, you know what, if there is a safe place for survivors to wait, that's what we want. We want people to have comfortable seating. It doesn't have to be a specific color. We want people to not have to run into the accused. So the infrastructure has to make provision for that, but it doesn't need to require a separate building. So we really tried to make the goals possible without making it so expensive that it's not viable to roll it out across the country. And I think that's one of the traps that government often fall into, right? So now we want good things, and we make requirements that are maybe attainable for 5 courts, but definitely not for courts across the country. And I think the voice of civil society in that process kept on saying, listen, we want people to be safe, we want people to be supported. All the formalistic requirements that government tend to rely on, we said, is this going to make survivors feel safe? Is this going to make survivors feel supported? If not, then we don't need that. But there are things that we will not budge on. For instance, We don't want survivors to run into the accused. We do want, if there is a court supporter, we do want them to be able to sit next to the survivor when the survivor testifies. So we really try to make the regulations reflect a court that would serve the needs of the survivor without being so expensive that it can't be replicated.
There are certain things that we can't measure. So it's great that we have sort of these measurable recommendations, and we can, check every year, walk into a sexual offences court and go and see whether it is there or it's not, whether the equipment is working or not. But, I had the privilege of interacting with one of the sexual offences courts not too long ago, and I have to say, what struck me the most was the atmosphere that was just a lot lighter. Everybody was wonderful, and you can think sexual offences or rape is a really, really, really horrid and traumatizing experience, and it's odd even to think about something that can make that experience a bit better. But these things also matter in terms of dignity, in terms of feeling supported, in terms of feeling believed, in terms of someone, just speaking to you as if you matter and as if what happened to you matter. And sort of, I think that was sort of the atmosphere and support and the feel around that really convinced me, wow, this would make a huge difference. Those are the things that you actually can't measure. And we also can't measure, go to a survivor and say, what was the experience like before and what is the experience now? We obviously don't, want that. But as a rape crisis, in your experience with survivors dealing with the sexual offences courts, has there been a shift in the narrative? Do you see that, how is those sort of holistic things come forward as contributing to make the process better?
We are obviously tempted to, as you say, measure the measurable things, right? We want to measure the conviction rate, and we want to measure is the equipment working. But there's a reason why the people in a sexual offences court, all of the stakeholders make you feel supported. It's because they are supported. The regulations make provision for, if there is a court supporter, that they are supervised by a social worker, that the NPA prosecutors get regular debriefing, that the magistrates get regular debriefing. So it's really attempting to make sure that that the people who are supposed to support the survivor are also supported. And I think what we've seen in our court support service is definitely that people build up strong relationships with their court supporter, that the court supporter often has a very good relationship with the prosecutor, and therefore can really be an advocate for the survivor. And I think that's important, to have collaborative relationships. And one of the I think the great things in the Western Cape specifically is that there are collaborative forums where different stakeholders can come together and work out these issues, because at the end we do need survivors to feel supported. And through our court support service, we can definitely see that people feel that the court is a place where they can tell their truth.
Sorry, Jeanne, I have to interrupt because we're running out of time. And just to say, I love that you sort of, what you're saying also is that the Sexual Offences Court is not just for the victim or the survivor to feel supported, but really to support all of the stakeholders. So I want to thank you very much for that. After the break, we're going to put up some details on the Rape Survivors Justice Campaign and how people can get involved and how we can all start monitoring. But we want to thank you very much for being with us. this evening.
Thanks.
And we are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this.
I didn't like to sit down and just watch.
All they know is that they've been to the justice system and it has failed them. Explain to them what is the role of Sexual Offences Court and the assistance that they get so that a survivor is able to stand there and tell a story.
What is rape crisis about? What do they? I know it's about rape, but I never knew that I can learn a lot from them. So deep inside my heart, I know, and I'm happy.
And that's all we have for this evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rassool. Good night.